This happened in the village of Zarakie, lost beyond the swamps, where even cell phones don't work. I went there in the summer on an assignment to collect folklore. The locals were sullen, but old man Yefim, the watchman of the abandoned farm, loosened up after some homemade vodka. Don't wander around here at night, boy, especially on a full moon. It gets quiet here, too quiet, he explained. Every few years, on a windless moonlit night, a dead silence would fall over the village. Not just silence, but absolute. All sounds would vanish. No crickets chirping, no trees creaking, no water gurgling in the well. The air would become thick like jelly. And then, from the forest, from the direction of the old cemetery, a sound would come. Not a scream, not a moan. Yefim, turning pale, said, like huge clay-soaked fingers slowly dragging across giant glass, a grinding and squeaking, long, very long. After that sound, someone in the village would disappear, not just leave, vanish without a trace. And on the doorstep of their house, they would find a lump of damp, cold clay, smelling of swamp and something metallic. Of course, I didn't believe it. Drunkard's nonsense. On the night of the full moon, with a recorder in my pocket, I went to that very cemetery. I wanted to record the atmosphere. It all started exactly at midnight. First, the frogs in the swamp fell silent. Then the wind. Then I stopped hearing my own breathing. It was physically palpable, like having cotton stuffed in my ears and my brain. I froze by an old collapsed burial vault. And then it came. The sound didn't come from the forest. It came from below, from under the ground beneath my feet. That exact sound. The grinding of wet clay on glass. Louder, closer. The earth under my boots became damp and cold. I bolted, but running in that silence was a mute nightmare. I couldn't hear my steps or my scream. Only that growing grinding in my bones. I looked back from the burial pit. Slowly, like a snail from its shell, something was emerging. It was made of that same clay, dark and gleaming in the moonlight. It had no clear shape, only pseudopods, appendages that, with a disgusting squelching sound, gripped the soil. And in the center of the mass gaped a hole from which that nightmarish squeal emanated. It was blind, but it sensed me, and it reached out. I ran, stumbling over mute tussocks, until I burst into Yefim's hut. He was sitting at the table, pale as death, staring at a lump of wet clay lying right on his threshold. "Our time isn't up yet," he whispered, not looking at me. "Yours isn't either. It left a mark. Now it will wait. Always be somewhere nearby, in the silence. I left at dawn. I thought I was safe. But that was only the beginning. Now, years later, I am afraid of silence. When at night the refrigerator suddenly stops humming, the faucet stops dripping, and there are no cars or wind outside, I freeze, and I wait. My heart pounds in the absolute, oppressive silence. And sometimes, in the most silent moments, at the edge of hearing, I catch it, barely, like a neighbor's glass scraping sound through three walls. It doesn't come right away. It lets you hope. It just reminds you, I am here, somewhere below you, or behind the wall, or right under the bed, in the darkness that has become too quiet. And yesterday morning, I found it by my front door, a tiny, pea-sized lump of cold, damp clay. It smelled of swamp and metal. It now knows where I live, and it's waiting for its silent night. This story was told to me by my grandfather, and to him by his father. It's about the village of Zauzeri, which stood in a remote place among swamps and an old forest. There were no proper roads, no communication. About 30 people lived there, no more. Everyone knew each other. In the summer of 1889, the birds in Zauzeri stopped singing. They didn't notice it right away. At first, it just seemed quieter in the mornings. Then the old woman Matriona said over tea, "Haven't heard the nightingale by the stream for a week now." People thought about it. It was true. No chirping, no chattering, no crow cries. Only the wind in the pines and the creaking of their own shutters. The silence became thick, viscous, like jelly. It pressed on the ears. Children stopped running and shouting, clinging to their mothers. The dogs didn't bark. They pressed against their owners' legs and whined softly, staring towards the forest. Even the livestock in the barns stood motionless, only occasionally shifting from foot to foot. And then the chickens started disappearing, not as usual from a fox or a polecat. They were found right in the middle of the yard, inside the hen house, with the door bolted shut, and not eaten. They were turned inside out, as if something had carefully, with surgical precision, inverted them alive through their beaks. No blood, no feathers. Just a small, wet lump of flesh in the shape of a bird. People panicked. The men walked with axes and pitchforks, standing guard at night. But they saw nothing. They only heard. The sound came late at night, when the darkness was absolute. From the direction of the swamp, it was a quiet, wet squelch. Not fast, but measured, as if something huge and heavy was slowly pulling its feet out of the quagmire and slapping them onto solid ground. And with each day, this sound was getting closer. It circled the village, slowly tightening the noose. The oldest resident, Uncle Arkib, blind and dried up like a puffball mushroom, said, sitting on the porch bench, "It's the clay man. He walks when all living things fall silent. He listens to the silence, and whoever he hears, he takes, so that inside them becomes silent too." One morning, the watchman Ignat didn't show up for duty. They found him in the guard hut. He was sitting on a bench, leaning against the wall. His mouth was open in a soundless scream. But the most terrible thing, his eyes, they were dead. Not glassy, like a dead man's, but matte, impenetrable, like those of a dried clay figurine. There was no doctor, but everyone understood. Ignat couldn't see or hear anything. He was empty inside, alive, but an absolutely empty vessel. A mad, quiet hysteria began in the village. They decided to flee. They gathered their bundles, loaded the children onto carts. It was decided to take the old corduroy road through the swamp, the only path to the mainland. They walked in single file, in complete silence, broken only by the crunch of brushwood underfoot and the suppressed cry of an infant, which the mother immediately muffled with her hand. The fog over the swamp was unnaturally white and thick, and then they saw him. He stood ahead on the path, 40 paces away, taller than the tallest pine, but thin to the point of clumsiness. His body seemed molded from wet, black swamp clay with water dripping off it. His facial features were blurred like on a smudged fingerprint. He had no eyes, only smooth clay hollows. And he didn't move. He just listened. The people froze, gripped by icy horror. The infant in the mother's arms whimpered from lack of air. The mother, crazed with fear, pressed his face harder against her chest, trying to stifle the sound. The clay head, slowly, with a barely audible creak, turned in their direction. A trickle of murky water flowed from the blurred mouth, and a sound emerged. Not a voice, but its complete opposite. A thick, sucking sound of absolute silence. The sound of a vacuum drawing in all the noises of the world. And then Piotr, a young lad, couldn't take it. He let out a wild scream, snatched an old Burden rifle from the cart, and fired. The roar of the shot was deafening, nightmarish, shattering the silence. It echoed across the entire swamp. The clayman shuddered. His clay body crackled like drying clay. He didn't scream in pain. He screamed from the sound. He let out a piercing, unbearable shriek, like the screech of iron on glass, but 1,000 times louder. People fell to the ground, clutching their ears, from which blood was already flowing. And then he began to fall apart, not dying, but simply losing form. He slumped into a shapeless, trembling pile of muck, which, with a quiet gurgle, sank beneath the quivering surface of the swamp. The people, deafened, half mad, somehow made it to the town. Did the story end? No. My grandfather, telling this, would always fall silent at the end and look somewhere into the darkness outside the window. Then he would say in a whisper, "They left." But those who survived, including my father, wrote one strange thing in a common testament. They bequeathed to all of us, their descendants, to never hear me, never return to those parts, and especially not to go to that swamp, because if it becomes very, very quiet there, if the wind dies down and the frogs fall silent, and even the mosquitoes stop buzzing, you must run. Run without looking back, and scream, and fire into the air. and ring bells. Because the clayman didn't die, he is just listening again and waiting for the world around him to freeze in perfect, flawless silence, to come out hunting again. He would draw the curtains tighter and add, and sometimes on the quietest, stillest nights, I think I hear outside the window a quiet, wet squelch. And the first thing I do is turn on the radio at full volume. Late 82nds. A remote village called Prokudino beyond the Urals. Winter. My grandfather, Pavel, was a tractor driver. He often returned from the farm late, after dark. The road passed by an old abandoned well with a crane hoist. Everyone knew to give it a wide berth. They never said why. They just scared the children. If you misbehave, the well will take you. One evening, in a heavy ground blizzard, my grandfather's tractor stalled right opposite that spot. Fixing it in the dark and snowstorm was suicide. He decided to walk the 3 kilometers to the village. He took his flashlight and set off. The wind howled so loud he couldn't hear his own footsteps. The snow blinded him. He walked and walked, the flashlight churning a yellow hole in the white swirl. And then he realized there were no familiar landmarks around. He had lost the road, and that winter, that meant certain death. He stopped, peered into the gloom, and saw a dark, gnarled silhouette in the distance. The well, he circled around it, went the opposite way, breathing a sigh of relief. He walked for another 20 minutes, and again saw the same gnarled silhouette ahead. The well, it stood before him as if he'd been walking in circles. Granddad cursed. He decided, I'll go over, sit on the leeward side, wait it out a bit, get my bearings. He approached. His breath steamed over the wooden frame. He leaned against the well sweep's support, started to light a cigarette, and then, through the wind's howl, he heard a splash. A dull, heavy splash of water far below, as if something large had stirred down there in the icy blackness. He froze. The cigarette fell from his lips. The splash came again, closer and closer still, not from below upward, but as if something was climbing up the wet wooden shaft, scrabbling, shuffling. Granddad jerked back, grabbed his flashlight, shone the beam into the black maw of the well. The icy interior glinted for a second, and in that second he saw a hand. A human hand, pale as wax, with swollen fingers. It lay on the frozen rim of the frame. Ice crunched. A second hand appeared. And between them, slowly, with a soft moan, a head began to crawl over the edge. Wet, dark hair plastered to its face. But he could see the face was his own. Exactly his own. Only a deathly blue with wide open, empty eyes staring right at him. He didn't scream. The horror stole the air from his lungs. He just staggered back, stumbled, and ran. He ran without seeing the path, falling, scraping his hands, hearing behind him a soft, wet slap, as if something heavy and soaked had tumbled out of the well onto the snow. and a quiet, rasping call, not a voice, but as if through water. Pavel, stai. He ran until he collapsed by the first huts, barking wild, inhuman cries. They found him in the morning, half frozen, with streaks of grey in his hair. He never told anyone what he saw. He just kept repeating one thing. It got out. It's walking now. After that, people in Prukudino started disappearing. Always in winter, during snowstorms, they were found in the spring when the snow melted by the old well dry, completely desiccated, as if all the moisture had been sucked out of them for years, and on each neck a blue, wet handprint. They filled the well with stones, but the old folks whisper that it won't help because it is already out and it remembers its name. It's waiting for everyone to forget to be afraid so it can start calling again from the darkness, from under the earth, from the very well that exists in every village.